7:30, and the latecomers will pay everyone a coffee.
Everyone will pay coffee to the latecomers will pay coffee to everybody. That's a good idea. Are there countries represented here? Korea. Exactly on time in Korea. What about Spain? Right on time. Okay. Somebody doesn't believe you. What about in Scotland?
On time as well.
On time, yes. I come from Canada. It's on time as well. I don't know, is there another country represented here?
In France it would be 45.
Yes, in France, yes. And we are in France, right? Which is why I'm buying time just now for the latecomers. Anyways, let's start nonetheless. I am going to introduce my friend Jonathan Ward to you. Jonathan is truly an international person because his parents came from two different cultures. He grew up in a third country. He's lived in several countries, and listen to this, he has 4 passports. Not stolen, 4 valid passports. It's a guessing game. Which countries do you think he has passports for?
French.
US.
French,
US.
Okay, French is wrong.
Canadian,
US is wrong.
No? Oh.
Canadian, American,
Canada, is that one of them? Okay, we've got one.
American,
No.
Australian,
UK.
UK,
Yes, okay, you have 2 of them.
Australia, India,
Singapore.
Australia,
No, I don't think so.
Australia, Australia,
Australia. No.
Japan,
Holland.
Japan. Holland. No. Help. Oh, too easy. Okay, Switzerland. One more. A European country. Belgium. No.
Sweden,
No.
Czech Republic.
Czech Republic. No.
Ireland.
An island. A European country which is an island. Think carefully. You should travel there. It's a very nice country to visit.
Italy?
No. Italy, it's not an island.
Tenerife,
Canaries, no. Someone said it here?
He said it earlier.
Republic of Ireland. Republic of Ireland. Yes, European country. So he has 4 passports. He is a family counselor and is very interested in cross-cultural situations, which is why we have invited him to speak to us. So he'll talk for 45 minutes or an hour, and I think he's going to try and have a little bit of interaction with us, and then we can have a time of questions at the end, and then don't run away because we'll serve some tea and coffee and juice at the end. So enjoy the conference, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's really good to be with you. Thank you for coming this evening. So we're going to think about this topic of culture shock. Culture shock, I think it's important, first of all, to say that culture shock is a common, normal experience for people who live in a culture that is different from their own. So the first thing to remember is that you are not strange, weird, crazy, or imbalanced if you have experienced or if you are experiencing culture shock. So let's look at what it is. It's important to know what we're talking about. When it comes to culture shock, there's feelings of disorientation. I'll read the definition that's here, first of all. Feelings of uncertainty because you don't understand what's going on, confusion, or anxiety that people may experience when being in a new country or surroundings. Just going to move my computer so I can see it a little bit better, so I don't have to keep looking this way. Okay, so there's a sense of disorientation, there's a sense of discomfort that's experienced when you're encountering a new and unfamiliar culture, and this is normal. Culture shock affects us emotionally, psychologically, and even physically, because culture shock is a form of stress. And we all know what stress does to us and how it affects us. Not just emotionally, like feeling lost or anxious, sometimes feeling lonely, sometimes feeling stupid because we don't understand what we're supposed to do in a certain situation. But it can also affect us physically because it's a form of stress, and so sometimes because we're experiencing this sense of lostness and confusion, then some of us may have trouble sleeping. Or we simply feel tense in the neck, in the shoulders, because our bodies express and carry the stress that we're feeling. And when we're in a new situation, a new country, I'm not talking about going for a vacation somewhere. I'm talking about settling and living in a new place for a significant amount of time. There's going to be feelings of stress. So here are a few examples, just a few. There are many, many examples that we could give. Being offended by perceived, because it may not be real, but it's how you see it, rudeness in the culture that you're settling in. Because the way people express themselves is very different. Sometimes you may think that people are being rude because you've just misunderstood what they're saying. But also, we all know that within communication, there's not just the words. There's the tone of voice, and there's the non-verbal body language. And non-verbal body language is a very cultural thing, very different from one culture to another. And so we can misunderstand, and we can think that people are being rude, when in fact they're just being very direct. Another example, not understanding workplace norms. Some of you are working in specific situations, or your spouse is working at, ITER, or maybe some other place, and every context, every workplace has its norms. What is expected of you? Now, hopefully, but this may not always be the case, you will have been briefed. It will have been explained to you what is expected. This is how we function here. This is what we expect of our employees. If that doesn't happen, it can become very confusing and frustrating, because you will behave on the basis of your own norms. Okay, a norm is what's normal, what you think is normal, and that's where we miss each other, and we get confused, and we don't understand. Another example: struggling to navigate the bureaucracy of a new country. Well, of course, that doesn't happen in France, does it?
No.
There's no problems with bureaucracy in France now, are there? Who's been having trouble with French bureaucracy? You can raise your hand if it's been a little bit of a challenge. Okay, French bureaucracy, they do it on purpose to test your patience, to make you into somebody who, yeah, that can be really hard. Difficulty with communicating, obviously. That's one of the most basic things. about culture shock, struggling with the food. Obviously, every country, the food is different. When I was living in Canada, I lived in an area where there were a lot of people from the country of India, mostly southern India, from the Kerala province. And I would see them with their plate of Canadian food, which to them was so bland. And they would grab whatever they could, like pepper, and just lots and lots and lots and lots of pepper, just to make it a little bit more spicy, just something. And I felt sorry for my friends, because that was hard for them. So those are just a few examples. Now, of course, a very French example is this one. That may have been a bit of a shock, part of your culture shock when you came to France, because maybe in your country, we just don't do that. And every country is different when it comes to greeting one another. And then you got to figure out, well, okay, if I have to kiss this person, which side do I start so that we don't bump noses? And I've discovered that in some countries it's different. I've discovered it in Switzerland, in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. They start on the opposite cheek than what I'm used to. Okay, so here are a number of words that may match how you're feeling. And I wonder which of these words fit how you feel. Different, pressure. I'm just reading some of the words that are here. Confused, alone. There's a really small one there. Oh, anxiety. Yeah. Anxious, frustrated. Oh, I wish I could understand. I don't understand. What does this mean? Why do they do this? Frustration. Roller coaster. You know what that is? Up and down emotionally. Homesickness. How about we just spend a few moments thinking about some of these words, and I'd like to invite you just to talk with the people who are sitting next to you, the 2-3 people, and just talk about which of these words fit. Look at all of those words there. Okay, I haven't read them all out, but which of the words that you see here fit how you're feeling, or how you felt when you first came? Okay, let's just take a few minutes to do that. Go ahead, you can just talk among yourselves and just say, well, this word, that really fits how I felt. And maybe there's another word that's not there that you'd like to use. That's fine too.
I came to France 40 years ago, so I don't have culture shock anymore, but I did when I came.
When I came here, I was completely lonely. I don't know anybody, so I was very anxious how to add my child to school. I don't know anything how to travel. So I felt very lonely and anxious.
Mixed feelings.
Very happy about the nature. I had mixed feeling. My emotional change. Mixed feeling because this country is different. I don't know the language and everything. Sometimes I was happy, sometimes I was like so mixed feeling. Feelings mixed my and I emotional because this thing
I felt useless because I wanted to work, I wanted to contribute to society, but I didn't speak French very well, and I felt outside of everything.
So when I finding out how to scan, it was difficult. That was a little embarrassing first time.
Yeah, embarrassing.
Here people greet always bonjour. Sometimes I wanted to read, but it won't come fast. By the time it comes, they will come. The moody as well. Moody.
Woody, yeah.
And food. For us, food.
Yeah, your food is so good and so different.
Food is still out. Food will be all the time.
I invite you to just finish what you're saying.
I'm sorry, I forgot to make an announcement. If you're not familiar with the premises here, there are sanitary toilets. You have to go outside and along the sidewalk here, and 1, 2, 3 doors down, you can find sanitary.
And in every culture, we have a different way of talking about that place, don't we? The British call it the loo. The Canadians call it the restroom. Sounds like they're going to go and rest in there. The Americans call it the washroom. Sounds like they're going to have a shower. Yeah. Okay. Culture shock has a number of stages. So let's talk about the stages of culture shock. On the vertical axis, we have how you feel, your emotional state, how you experience the situation. And here we have the amount of time that you spend in the new country. So what usually happens is that when you first arrive, it's what we call the honeymoon stage. You know what a honeymoon is? It's like when you're first married. It's like, oh, wow, it's wonderful, it's just perfect, it's great, oh, I love it here, it's so fascinating, it's so thrilling, it's so... That's not going to last very long, but it will last for a little while. And of course, it all depends on how easily, when you first get here, you've been able to find a place to live and get the kids into a school and all of those things. Some of those things will have maybe been prepared ahead of time for you. Perhaps some of those things will have been done for you by your employer. If you've got to struggle with settling and all the details of settling yourself, then very, very quickly you're going to start going down on that roller coaster. So there's this initial excitement, there's these positive feelings when you're exposed to a new culture. A sense of wonder, a sense of fascination. But then there's some anxiety that begins to come. It's culture shock. That's where the culture shock starts coming in. And this is where the differences become more apparent between your home culture and what we call your host culture. And it becomes more challenging. And there will be some common reactions: frustration, homesickness. Oh, it's so much better back home. It's so much easier back home. Confusion. Many of the words that we saw on the previous slide. And very often we'll ask ourselves, but why do they do it this way? We try to make sense of the behaviors that we see. And usually when we're in this stage, we think that what we see is weird, silly, impractical, rude, funny, or wrong. And so we judge and we criticize because we compare with how we do things in our home culture. Because, of course, our home culture is what's normal, n'est-ce pas? You may wonder, why is the French administration so complicated? Let me reassure you, the French also find it frustrating. But things function the way they do for reasons. that are historical and structural and cultural, like in every country. Then we hopefully are able to gradually enter into what we call the adjustment phase. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but I'd like to ask another question, and then we'll go back to that slide. Let's think about, why do we have this culture shock reaction? And there's actually a whole bunch of reasons why we experience culture shock. Now, of course, there's the language barrier, and then there are the social customs, and then there's the difference in value systems. Now, the advantage of living in another culture is that it makes you more aware of your own culture and your own value system. Let's look at what it says on this slide. Sometimes there's the stress that I mentioned earlier, due to the strain of just coping, mental adjustment. You've got to figure out how to do things and what's going on. Loss, a sense of loss because of what you've left behind and you no longer have here. Loss of friends, loss of family, loss of structure, loss of things that are familiar to you. And so, homesickness. This is normal. Friends, status, occupation, possessions. Sometimes there's feelings of rejection. That's the third one down. Because you feel rejected by certain people within the new culture. Because they don't understand you, you don't understand them. Or sometimes you may reject these people yourself because you just feel like there's too much effort or too much distance. Confusion about your own role, about other people's expectations of you, of who you are, why you're here, what you're supposed to do. That can happen in the workplace. Values, your own feelings, your own identity. It's interesting that when we're in a different culture, we begin to think about things that we didn't think about before in terms of values, because we see the difference. Surprise, fear, or indignation. The word indignation is a reaction that we have when our values don't seem to match what we see happening. Let me give you an example. I've been to certain countries where I'm not sure where to go. And so I'll ask someone for directions. And it's only later that I realize that they don't know where I'm trying to go. But they won't tell me, I'm sorry, I can't help you. They will give me directions. And I will go in that direction because I believe them and I trust them. It's not the right direction. And I end up being even more lost. Now, to me, with my value system and my restricted cultural vision of things, I might be tempted to say to myself, well, that person just lied to me. That wasn't helpful at all. Well, I need to understand what's going on. I need to understand something about that culture. Why is it that people behave in that way? And that's the same for every culture that we encounter. What's going on? And then there is that sense of helplessness sometimes. And it's a little bit difficult to read what it says there, but helplessness, I'll read it, because you think you cannot cope with the new environment. I'm not saying that that's true, but that's maybe what you may think sometimes. This is too hard. This is really hard. I'm not sure I can cope. I think we also need to be aware of how our preconceived ideas and how stereotypes can intensify our experience of culture shock. Oh, well, the French, yeah, they're this way. Or the Italians, or whatever culture it is. And there are stereotypes. We have stereotypes for pretty much every culture. Now, a stereotype is something that leads us to think that everybody behaves the way we think they do, based on that belief. And we don't look for the exceptions, and we don't realize that that's a generalization. And that can get us into trouble sometimes with how we try and understand people. So let's get back to the other, this phases of culture shock. And after a certain amount of time, now it will be different for different people, and it depends on a whole number of factors. But after a certain amount of time, hopefully you will begin to adjust, because you begin to understand. It'll be a lot easier if you're able to learn the language, of course. And so we start adapting, and we develop coping mechanisms and strategies, because we realize that it's important to try to understand why things function the way they do, and why people behave the way they do. And understanding brings tolerance, and that's really important. And this is where it becomes a big help if we can find support from local people and from other expatriates. I know that some of you have been able to join a language class. This is very valuable because it gives you a sense of support and understanding, and a sense of being together in the same boat, as we say in English. And if you feel strange and not normal on your own, it's difficult and it's isolating. But if you feel strange and not normal with others who feel the same thing, then you realize it's okay, and you feel much better. And so we reach this adaptation phase, which is based on our acceptance of the new culture. And this is where we have integrated, at least to a certain extent, into the new culture. And it will take several years to get to this final point here of acceptance, where we've really fully adapted to our surrounding culture. Several years it will take several years to get from here to over here. So don't feel discouraged if you think that it's taking a long time. Now let's look at this slide. It's basically the same idea. On the vertical axis, they've just put level of satisfaction, but it's the same. It's how you feel, how well it's going for you. Time in the country. And so we've got the same idea of the honeymoon phase, the culture shock. You recover from the culture shock. We didn't see that on the previous slide, but sense of recovery, moving to adjustment. But then what's going to happen? You're going to return home. And you're going to go back to your home culture. What's that going to be like? Well, we think that it's going to be fine because we're going home. We're going back to all those good things that are familiar, the food and the people and the friends and the values. And we don't expect to experience reverse culture shock. But what's happened? You've changed. And the culture that you're going back to has probably changed. Now, it depends on the culture. Some cultures change a lot in a short space of time, depending on what happens. Others change more slowly, but our world is changing. I mean, think about all the changes just in the last 10 years in terms of communication and just all kinds of things. So you've changed, the culture you're going back to has changed. And you've got probably a wider perspective on just culture and people. More tolerance, more understanding. And you have become, even if it's only a little bit, somewhat multicultural. But you're going back into a context which is monocultural. Unless you're going back into a very big city which already has a big mix of all sorts of cultures, which is the case in most capital cities today. But if you're going back to your little village where you grew up, where you used to work and where you used to live, and you meet up with your friends again and your family who've never been outside of their own country and don't know many people who have, it'll be a shock. So you're going to experience what we've talked about in reverse. And then there'll be the recovery, and then there'll be the readjustment. Now, when we go back to our home culture, we don't expect it to be different, and we don't expect to experience culture shock, but we do. So now you know. And it's normal. It will be normal. Just tell yourself, this is okay. This is normal. I'm feeling, having trouble getting back to understanding how things function. While you've been here for the years that you've been in France, maybe you've begun to appreciate the different cultures. Sorry, I'll say that again. You've maybe come to appreciate that different cultures have different qualities. And that there are certain things about, for example, the French culture, that maybe you would like to hold on to and integrate into your life back home, but which your friends and family back home may not understand. And they'll just think, well, that's strange. Maybe they'll think it's great. Depends what it is that you want to hold on to. You may have become attached to certain people and friendships and certain aspects of this culture. And when you return to your home country, you may feel a sense of loss. And you may experience some grieving. You know grief? We often think that in order to grieve, well, someone has to die. But we grieve anytime that we lose something that we're attached to, someone or something. And so you may find yourself getting attached to a certain degree to what you've experienced here. And so there's inevitably going to be a sense of loss. And again, this is normal. I'm probably going to say that several times. But I think it's important for us to normalize the experience of culture shock, even if it's not a comfortable thing to experience. And it's only after you've lived in another culture that, like I said earlier, you begin to see your own culture in a different way with its positives and its negatives. I've lived in 4 countries, and in each country I notice how people communicate and the degree to which their communication and my own is implicit or explicit. And it helps to understand this. In some cultures, like the Dutch in the Netherlands, or the Americans in the United States, people generally tend to say what they think and to mean what they say. It's what we call an explicit culture. It's also known as a low context culture. People are more direct in how they communicate. In other cultures, communication is more implicit, more indirect. It's what we call a high context culture. Why? Because you have to rely on understanding the context. Because you can't just understand what people say based on the words. I'm not a fan of spicy food is an implicit way of saying I don't like spicy food. It's a bit chilly in here, is an implicit way of saying, can we turn up the heat? It's cold. I'm not sure if I can make it, is an implicit way of saying I won't be able to attend. That is how some people communicate when they come from an implicit culture. But when you're living in a more explicit culture, people aren't always going to understand what you really mean because you haven't said it clearly and directly enough. Americans will talk about how much they earn or how much they paid for their new house. And they might ask you the same thing. Here in France, people won't do that. It's considered personal and private. Now, where are the French on this? The French are more midway between an explicit culture and an implicit culture. People here don't always say directly what they think, but sometimes they do. And you have to interpret or decode what they really mean, but not as much as if you're in an implicit culture. And you also, in French culture, have to understand what people mean based on what isn't said. In French, we have an expression, les non-dits. What is left unsaid, but carries meaning. And some of you come from cultures where communication is much more implicit than French culture. And that's where it can get confusing and difficult. Now, I would never have realized this if I had lived in the same country all my life. You know, this difference in communication. I think what's really helpful is, we talked about having the support of other people. I think it's very helpful in those kinds of situations to have a friend from the host culture that you're in, or just someone that can help you understand. When French people say that, what does it really mean? And for you to be open to people asking you that. When you say that, what does it really mean? Is it a yes? Is it a no? Is it a maybe? A very helpful book. I've put a number of books here on the table, so at the end you can come and have a look at them. Please don't take them away; they're mine. But please have a look, and you might be interested in ordering them. One book I find is incredibly helpful. It's called The Culture Map. I really, really recommend this book because it talks about all sorts of different countries around the world, different cultures. And it really helps you to understand your own culture and these different cultures that you're in. And it's very helpful for business people and families and just whatever situation you're in. Now, for your children, understanding how to communicate will usually happen much quicker. I'm sure you've noticed this. Why? Because children's brains are like a sponge. They absorb what they see and they adapt. Partly because they're young, partly because they are more easily influenced by their context, and partly because they want to be accepted by their context. It's very hard for a child to feel like he doesn't fit in. Very hard. The positive thing is our children's young brains enable them to learn a new language with more speed and less effort. And because they are immersed in the multicultural context of, for many of you who have children, it's the international school, with kids from many different countries, then your children may not feel as strange or as isolated as their parents. When my 3 children were in French primary school, their teacher was worried. She was very French. And she was really worried that speaking English at home and French at school would be bad for them. And she came and saw us and talked to us of her concern. She said it's bad for their brains, and they're going to get confused. And that teacher was completely ignorant about the benefits of bilingualism, which is a huge advantage in life. Your children will also begin to develop a bicultural or a multicultural identity, which makes them feel connected and comfortable in this culture as well as in their own. And so let's think about this for a moment, because it's important to understand. Whereas parents are in more of a bubble, knowing that their assignment here is temporary, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, with more limited social interaction with the French culture, just what is needed, perhaps for some of you, to function, to buy bread, to go to the doctor, to do your job. Your children's bubble is what we call more permeable. Okay? It lets, something that's permeable means it lets water through, or it lets. And so your children are going to be more interconnected and intertwined with the local culture, with a more permanent posture towards being in France. Not because they're going to stay here once you leave, but because 4 or 5 years is a long time for a child. And so for a child, it feels a lot more permanent. And so the attachment will be stronger. And so this is what this diagram tries to show. It's that the local cultural context, see this space here? Much bigger than this space over here for the parent. So you can expect your child to adopt, to embrace certain things about French culture. The values, the beliefs, the attitudes, the behaviors, lots of things. This is normal. If you want your child to remain exactly the way you are, then stay in the same culture. Don't move them out of it. Because it's inevitable that they will develop habits and attitudes and behaviors partly based on this culture. But it can also make our children feel sometimes like they don't belong anywhere. Because a bicultural or multicultural experience can raise questions about how one experiences one's cultural identity, one's roots, and one's sense of identity. Who am I? Where do I really belong? What's the real me? I feel comfortable here. I feel comfortable over here. And every time I talk to people, they say to me, you're not really from here, are you? Yes, I am. Well, I want to be. I want people to behave as if I'm from here, but I know I'm not fully from here. And so there's this mix of identity, of cultural identity, and we need to help our kids sort through that and realize that it's not a problem. It's a real benefit. But they have to be able to understand the benefits of multiculturalism. There's a great book that I'd like to recommend to you This is the second book I'm going to recommend. If you just want to, look at two books in particular, but there's lots over there, including books about French culture. But it's this one, Third Culture Kids. If you need a book to help you understand your children and how they experience being in a different culture and growing up in a different culture, then this is a very, very interesting book, very helpful. Now we can talk a little bit more about the impact on children when we have question and answer time a little bit later. So if you have specific questions about that, we can go into a little bit more detail. But I'd like to just move on to the impact that there might be on your marriage, if you're married. The impact of culture shock on your marriage is that one of the things is that you may not process what you are experiencing in the same way, you and your spouse. And you may not process it at the same rate. So on the curve that we saw earlier, one of you may still be in culture shock, and the other one is moving their way up towards adaptation. It will depend on the level of language that you've been able to acquire. It depends on your interactions that you have with other people, how much opportunity you've had to understand how this culture functions. There's a number of factors that will influence this. One spouse may feel more homesick than their partner. Because again, homesickness is linked to attachment. And we have different degrees of attachment to our home culture, to our friends, to our families, based on our stories, based on our history. One may feel more connected to the local culture because their French is at a higher level. One may find it harder to be here because their partner is working and has colleagues who've become friends, and the other is feeling more isolated. Let's think about ways to cope. Just a few thoughts, a few tips maybe. I think it's really important, and I'm sure you've probably understood this from what I've said already. It's important to develop cultural awareness and sensitivity by reading books, articles, and also by choosing to adopt a posture of openness to the differences that you encounter. Maintain an open mind and try to understand why the French do what they do. If you get to know a few French people well enough to be able to say to them, please help me understand why people do this or do that, it will be a big help. Understanding breeds acceptance in your mind, or at least tolerance, and allows you to avoid being critical and judging. I think we need to be careful about making value judgments based on comparisons between our own culture and the other culture. If I compare and then conclude their way of being and doing is wrong or stupid, it develops an us and them mentality. And of course, within the us is what we believe is right and good and normal and logical. Now, we often can't help comparing things and people. I think that's pretty human. But if I can use my comparisons to understand and appreciate that things here are simply different, rather than things here are inferior, then perhaps I won't be so critical and upset. So what I'm saying is, comparing, that's pretty normal. We all do that. But it's what that leads you to, which will make the difference. If I look at this culture and I compare it to my home culture, and my conclusion is, honestly, I mean, so stupid. Why do they do that? It'd be so much easier to do it the way we do it. Or I can say, okay, it's different. Well, of course it's different. It's a different culture. I'm going to try and understand why. And I'm going to try and learn that it's different, but it's okay. Try and be creative in my approach rather than resistant or critical. That's not easy. It's not easy. Talk regularly within your family and with your children about how each of you is doing. I think this is an important thing to do. How each of you within the family is experiencing being here in France. And then what you want to do is normalize those feelings. Not say, well, you shouldn't be feeling that way, but just, that's okay. Yeah, you're feeling frustrated, you're feeling confused. This is normal. It's normal and okay to feel disconnected, to feel lonely sometimes, to feel lost when you don't understand. And it's okay for your child to feel like he or she belongs to two worlds, which is what will happen after a certain number of years. The world back home and the world over here. The world, or while you're here, the world inside the home and the world outside the home. Two different worlds. Another tip, and I'm going to close with these tips. Learn the language. It probably sounds pretty obvious, and I know that a lot of you are doing that, but if people don't learn the language, it's really tough. You're going to feel very, very isolated. So join a language class if you haven't already. And establish a support network. Don't stay isolated. Join in activities where you can meet people from your own culture who are here, if there are some, and from other cultures, and from the French culture. Okay, so there's basically kind of three groups. There's the other people from your own culture that you can meet here. There's the people from other countries, but then there's also the French people. And a good way to do that is to know that, maybe all of you know this, but maybe some of you don't. There's a church community that meets here every Sunday morning, so why not come along? Because that's an opportunity also to mix and meet people from other cultures. And the last thing, maintain a sense of humor. That will save you. It really helps to just have a sense of humor and just say, oh, it's okay. I did something stupid, or this person thought I was maybe rude or whatever. I'll have to just tell you a little story about my Canadian co-worker. She went into a French shop and she wanted to buy a souvenir for her son who lives in Canada. She wanted to buy him a sweater. Okay? So she goes into this French shop in our local town and she asks for... So she got the masculine and the feminine wrong. So that can happen to many of you, right? Because that's a tricky thing. She says, "Je veux une poule," okay, which is a chicken. Now this is a clothing store, so the French shop assistant is kind of trying to figure out, well, why would you come into my shop and ask for a chicken? And so my coworker says, yeah, I want to buy she says it in French, I want to buy a chicken, for my son in Canada so that he can wear it. Took a while before the French shopkeeper understood that, oh, un pull. Not une poule, but un pull, which comes from the English, a pullover. Sweater or a jumper or whatever you call it. So these kind of things can happen, and I think you just have to be able to laugh at yourself. Okay, so let's have a few questions. If you have some questions about anything that I've said, anything that maybe wasn't clear, or something that you'd like to focus on a little bit more and talk a little bit more about. Brad.
Would you say that culture shock could vary in intensity according to the distance between two cultures? Like some cultures are closer than others.
Yeah, I think that would generally be true. Yeah, and I think the tricky thing about that is that when we're entering into another culture that we think is pretty close to our own, we don't expect that there's going to be much culture shock, but there is. So I mean, within Europe, various European cultures, we may think, well, it's Europe, it's all kind of the same. It's not. But of course, moving around within Europe is not going to incur as big a shock as somebody moving, from France to, the other side of the world with a totally different culture. So that's pretty obvious. But sometimes we just don't expect to have culture shock, and yet we do. The British are quite different from the French, and the French are quite different from the Dutch, and the Germans, and if you think about it in terms of, again, what I talked about, implicit and explicit. I saw when I was kind of preparing this that, interestingly enough, I hadn't realized that, but one of the most explicit cultures, where people are just very direct and they say what they mean and they mean what they say, is the Swiss Germans.
Yes.
Swiss Germans, yeah. And they will take at face value everything that you say. So they won't necessarily understand, when you're sometimes when you're joking, and if you say a joke with a straight face, they think you're being serious. So it's just helpful to understand where your culture is on that line between implicit and explicit. And the more it's implicit, the more it's going to be difficult in terms of communication. So I'm amazed when I've met quite a few Swiss Germans who've gone to work in Africa. And it's great. I mean, they do well there. Most of them do, because they've realized this is a totally different culture, and I need to learn. I need to figure out and understand that the way people communicate here is very, very different. And most of them are able to figure that out. But yeah, it's a big contrast. Yeah.
One question. Actually, whatever you said today, I can perfectly relate with my feelings.
Yeah.
And about the child, what you said, I just want to know, because I have a confusion. You said the babies are like the children's are very easily adapt the bilingual, like if they want to know the language of the country, if you're moving some other country.
It happens quicker for children than it does for adults.
So
Yeah.
I have a confusion for my 2-year kid.
Yeah.
And now the confusion is like in home we are speaking Hindi,
Yeah.
and when he's going to crèche they speak French, and to communicate some English speaking the person there, he need English as well. So it's easy for them, or I need.
So how many languages is your 2-year-old juggling? There's Hindi,
Hindi,
there's English, and there's French. So there's 3 languages.
3 languages.
Yeah.
So he'll okay.
That should be fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
My wife spoke German
Okay.
to our kids when they were at home, very young,
Okay.
except when I came home, because I don't speak German, unless she wanted to talk about me behind my back. So when I would get home from work, we would switch to, well, initially we were living in Canada. We were living in Canada in an English-speaking context. So the home language for all of us together was French. We all spoke French when we were at home. She would speak French to our 3 children. She would speak German to our 3 children when she was alone with them, when they were very young. And then they would get English from everybody else, from preschool and other interactions. And they were fine. My children are not confused. They did well, so it's fine. Yeah, I mean, a young child's brain is just amazing how they can. My wife grew up speaking 5 languages fluently, but with no effort. She grew up in Africa, and so she grew up speaking Portuguese, which was the national language because it was a African country colonized at that time by the Portuguese. And her mother was Swiss German, and her father was French speaking, and she spoke Umbundu, which was the local tribal language of the people they were working with. And then she learned Afrikaans. And so, now the one thing that people like that may experience, and my wife will say this too, is that she speaks all these languages, and some of them she still speaks today. She doesn't speak Afrikaans anymore. But she's always felt that she wasn't totally 100% comfortable in any one of those languages. She kind of felt like she wasn't able to master any of them as well as she would like. And in each of those languages, when she spoke them, people would say, you're not from here, are you? Because she'd have a slight accent, and that really bothered her. So, but I'm not saying that will happen for your child. I would say the advantages of growing up with several languages far outweigh any frustrations that there might be. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, same problem. My son is also having.
Not a problem.
The problem is that we are coming from Kerala. It is the southern part of India.
Yeah.
And then we moved to northern part of India.
Okay.
There, most of the people speak in Hindi.
Oh yeah.
So what my son, he don't have any language. He mix Hindi, he mix English.
Okay.
Because he's watching cartoons in English.
Right.
So
and then in Kerala it's what, Malayalam or something? Yeah.
So whenever he speaks to his grandma, all the languages are mixed.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
so there will be a certain point. How old is your son?
Right now he's 9.
Okay.
But still he can speak English fluently.
Yeah.
French he will not mix with English.
Okay.
English he will not mix with French.
Okay.
But when he speaks Malayalam, this issue comes. He will mix Hindi.
He mixes Hindi with Malayalam. Yeah. That should become unmixed at some point, and it probably will.
Still, that problem.
Yeah. He'll begin to. There's a certain point where the brain begins to get things in the right category, in the right slot.
That in which language he might be thinking.
Yeah. I wouldn't worry about it. I really wouldn't. It's not worth worrying about. It'll sort itself out in his brain. Probably once he's into his teenage years.
He also twist to say Sukumaran, he will say Sukuraman. He will just twist it.
Yeah.
The only that happens while speaking in Malayalam.
Mm-hmm.
Not in
Yeah. Yeah. There's that juggling different languages means that there will be some confusion sometimes.
He started speaking very late.
And
before he didn't.
Okay.
Speak it.
Yeah. Now, if your child, I don't know if this is, if your child does have maybe a learning disability, then that would maybe add to some of the confusion.
But he learned English very well.
Mm-hmm.
Because through the cartoons, he knows to speak English very well. Even after coming here, he learned French.
Yeah.
But some language, it's.
Yeah. And I don't know. I suppose it's maybe when languages are very close to each other. I mean, is Malayalam very similar to Hindi, or are they very different?
Different.
So I don't know. I don't know why he's just mixing those two languages and not the other languages.
Those are the language which he learned first.
Okay.
When he was very young.
Yeah. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Yeah. I think hopefully it should sort itself out.
But he's not worrying about. I'm worrying about.
Yeah, well, of course, because you're the parent. Oh no, my child is mixing it all together. Yeah. I think it's okay.
Do some people not get over the hump of culture shock, like into the adjustment phase and I forget, the acceptance
Yeah.
phase?
Well, like I said, if you struggle learning the language, it's going to be hard. If you don't have a good support network and a social network, and you don't make friends, it's going to be hard. I'd say it's also going to be hard if you're here, but you didn't really want to be here. It's your spouse that came because of the job, and you came because. And that's hard because there's also a question of motivation, right? It's if you're coming to a new place and it's like, I've chosen to be here, and I want to be here, and I'm going to make the effort to integrate. That's different from someone who says, well, I'm here because I have to be here, and I can't wait to get home. That's going to make it harder. Now, if you're part of a fairly big expat group of your own culture, then it's very easy to just stay within the bubble and just have friends within your own culture and meet up with people in your own culture and eat the food that you're familiar with if you can get the spices here. But you won't benefit from integrating into this culture, which may be a bit of a shame. I don't know. I think it's always good to try and integrate as much as you can, just to benefit from meeting other people and seeing how they live and how they think and that kind of thing. But yeah, so some people will find it harder. Part of it is the reasons why you came and the motivation that you have to integrate. We talk about, in English, we have this expression, your comfort zone. A lot of this is about that. Moving out of your comfort zone or staying within your comfort zone. And personality also has an effect on how willingly and how easily we integrate or not. Somebody else had their hand up. Yeah.
As a question is, do you agree with the opinion that no matter how many languages the children study, but there still exists the first language, second language, or third language? Or even it's possible for one child can have the 2 or 3 language as this first language at the same time. So, yeah.
It's a debate among linguists, I think.
Yeah, because that first language can support the profound thinking and analyze everything. Yeah.
Well, I grew up with English and French equally, in equal measure, and I'm comfortable in both. And I would find it very hard to tell you which is my first language.
Okay, so both can be your first language.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can dream in French, and I can dream in English. And to me, my dreams are based on the context of what I'm dreaming about, usually. I mean, the language of my dream. If it's a French context and I'm dreaming about French people or a French situation, usually it's in French that I'm dreaming. And if it's something that happens in an English-speaking context, sometimes it'll be mixed, but not there's kind of contextual. But I don't know. Yeah, I'm not personally. I'm not an expert. Okay, so, but personally, I don't 100% believe in the idea of there being a first language, like totally 100%, and then the second language is definitely a second language, rather than there being 2 languages that a child feels equally comfortable with. I think I think that's possible. I've seen that because both languages really were learned together. I mean, for me, I suppose it depends on periods of life. That's what I would say. I mean, my home language was English with my parents. And I started to read and write English because my parents taught me at home, just to give me a bit of a head start, before I could read or write French. But I could speak French. Then I went to school in France, little primary school. And there, my level of reading and writing English just kind of stayed where it was. And my French reading and writing went way up. And then And then later for my studies, for my further education, much later, I went to the UK. I did my university studies, which expanded my vocabulary and brought it way up, actually beyond what my high school French, well, when we say high school French, it means we don't speak terribly well, but what I mean is the level of vocabulary and studies that I had. So, you know what I mean? Like at different stages of life, I think a child, you know, and there may be a stage where it's pretty equal. That's been my experience.
Yeah, I would compute that question, a furthermore question that would your dominant language, either it's the first one or the second one, would have a way in.
Yeah. Well, I'd say there's maybe dominant languages, but they would be at different times in a person's life. And that what is dominant for one period of time may no longer be dominant for... I know that I've experienced that, you know, and depending on how long I've lived in a certain place, and then I moved to another place, and then... So I would tend to say that the dominant language is not necessarily going to be the same language throughout your life.
And also it depends subject.
That's true.
Because one of our children, when she has problem, she speaks in English with her father, not in French.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and yet French is her main language.
Yeah. 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 Any more questions? Our time is almost up. We're pretty well is up, but okay. So do have a look at the books if you're interested in just seeing what's there. Particularly maybe some of the books. If you're still going to be here for a few years and you really want to try and figure out French, French people, French culture, then there's some interesting books there that you might want to look at, and also books about transition, culture shock, children, all of that. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think we can...